Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for staying after such a long day. So let me see if I can make this work. Okay, so first I would like to thank the Turkish Green Crescent Society for their kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would like to start the presentation just introducing what my organization is doing. So we're called the International Drug Policy Consortium, or IDPC. And we're a global network of 118 non-governmental organizations from all around the world. The Turkish Green Crescent Society is also a member of IDPC. And what we try to do is to come together to try to promote an objective and open debate on drug policy. And the policies that we promote are policies that are based on health, on human rights, on development, on social inclusion, and on civil society participation. And one of the key objectives of IDPC is to build the capacity of NGOs to engage in drug policy debates and to share their experience with policymakers. So going straight to my presentation, we've talked a lot about harm reduction over the past 2 days, at least, mention it here and there, but what I'm going to try to do here is try to define what harm reduction actually is. So just the premise of our drug control policies, our global drug control system is about 100 years old now, and the way governments have tackled drugs so far was to traditionally put together a war on drugs approach. So that's to say that governments have implemented tough drug laws and threatened people with severe punishment to deter them from getting involved in the drugs trade. And the objective of that was to try to achieve a drug-free world. About 100 years later now, we have seen the results of such a policy. And what we have seen is that there has actually been no significant reduction in the global drug the global drug market, and there has been no significant impact on the prevalence of drug use. We've heard yesterday a few presentations on Turkey where they were acknowledging that in Turkey, drug use was actually on the increase. What is actually even more concerning, well, so you can see at the international level, actually, there's the same kind of acknowledgement. So this is just a quote from the World Drug Report of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. So that was in 2012, and UNODC said there may be some 65 million additional drug users by 2050. So we're nowhere near achieving a drug-free world. The issue with our drug control system is that in addition to that, it's actually led to severe negative consequences. One of which is the rise in powerful organized crime, which has also been associated with the increase in violence and corruption. There's also been a mass incarceration of people caught in the drugs trade. And what we have seen actually is that the people who are incarcerated are not the high-level drug traffickers. They're actually very often people caught for possession for personal use or drug users. So that's highly problematic. There's also been significant human rights violations. Faye has touched upon these, so I'm not going to go deep into this issue. Here I'm going to focus on the health issues. So the global drug control system and the war on drugs approach has actually been associated with significant health issues. So around the world, according to the United Nations, there's 12.7 million people who inject drugs worldwide. Among these, about 10% of them, so that's 1.7 million people who inject drugs, live with HIV. And as Peter Sarosi said in his presentation just before this one, this means that 1/3 of new HIV infections are caused by injecting drug use. So this is outside of Sub-Saharan Africa, but this is still a significant amount of HIV infections that are caused by drug use. And additional information submitted by the UN is that more than 50% of people who inject drugs live with hepatitis C. So according to this data, it's about 6 million people who inject drugs. And in terms of overdoses, these are the primary contributor of the global drug-related deaths. So this is what harm reduction is trying to do, actually, trying to reduce these significant health issues related to drug use. So harm reduction refers to policies, programs, and practices that aim primarily at tackling the adverse health consequences related to drug use. And so the objective of harm reduction is to reset the objectives of our drug policies. We're no longer trying to just achieve a drug-free world. This is not the key priority anymore. The key priority is to tackle the health, social, and economic consequences associated with it. So at the premise of harm reduction is the acceptance that there will be some level of drug use in our society. It's the acceptance that some people may be unwilling or unable to stop using drugs. And something that has been a bit lost in this conference so far, and I would like to highlight here, is that according to the United Nations around the world, there's only about 1/10 of people who use drugs who actually have a drug dependence issue. So that's something we need to keep in mind when we put together services to treat people who use drugs. We really need to make sure that the treatment services that we put together reach people who are actually dependent. And these are only 10% of all the people who use drugs. In terms of harm reduction, we're actually tackling every single person who uses drugs. We're trying to reach people where they are at. So if they need to keep using drugs, then we need to make sure that we put together services that save their lives. And actually, harm reduction is also based on the premise and on the realization that most of the harms that are associated with drug use are actually easily preventable, with services that reach people and that benefit them, but they also benefit not only people who use drugs, they benefit their families and also benefit the community. And I'll get back on this when I talk about a few key harm reduction services. Harm reduction targets risks. So it means that every single country will need to evaluate what are the key risks that are associated with drug use and how best to tackle them. Harm reduction also evolves over time. Patterns of drug use evolve, and harm reduction will need to respond to new patterns of use. And also, because patterns of drug use differ from country to country, from region to region, then harm reduction might be slightly different from one country to another. But the premise is the same. Harm reduction is also adapted to the specific needs of some key vulnerable groups. And these include, for example, women. These include children. Faye has already touched on this. Children are particularly vulnerable from certain risks, so we need to make sure the harm reduction services reach them and are adapted to their needs. And something that's very important to remember is that harm reduction started about 40 years ago. So we have a tremendous amount of evidence and experience on what works best in terms of harm reduction. And it's also cost effective, something I'll get back to a bit later. So the United Nations has developed a comprehensive package of harm reduction interventions, which are available here. These have already been slightly touched upon this morning with the World Health Organization presentation on prisons and health. So I won't go into too much detail, but I would like to focus on two of these interventions. And also just to say that these interventions are not, they are comprehensive package, but there's a lot of other harm reduction interventions that you can fit into harm reduction. So these are not exhaustive, this list. What's also important to note on this comprehensive package is that they are sorted in order of priority. So the United Nations actually declared that needle and syringe programs and opioid substitution treatment are very, very high importance harm reduction interventions. So that's why I'm focusing on those here. So first, needle and syringe programs. So this comes from the fact that sharing injecting equipment is associated with a very high risk of transmission of blood-borne diseases, including HIV and hepatitis B and C. So some service providers all around the world have started distributing sterile injecting equipment. So we are going from here, a situation where there are discarded needles are shared among people who use drugs, they put themselves at significant risks, and also engage in a place where they can talk to healthcare and social workers to talk about their drug use, to talk about the risks associated with their drug use, and potentially talk about integrating a treatment system. And in terms of protecting the community, it's also a way to dispose safely of dirty needles to make sure that they don't pose a problem on people who use drugs, but also on the rest of the community. As you can see from this figure, which is drawn from the Global State of Harm Reduction, 86 countries around the world have now adopted needle and syringe programs. So we're talking about a significant amount of countries around the world, in a lot of regions around the world actually, that have adopted needle syringe programs, both in the communities and in some countries also in prisons. We've heard this morning from the WHO presentation that these are very important to adopt also in prisons. So just to show you this slide. Right, so now turning to opioid substitution treatment. So this intervention is to try to substitute heroin use with substances such as methadone and buprenorphine as part of a treatment for people dependent on heroin. Because these substances are orally taken, this significantly reduces the risks of injection and of needle sharing and then of associated risks. So the evidence shows all around the world that this has drastically improved the general health conditions of people who use drugs. It's also reduced lethal overdoses. And it's actually reduced criminal activity because people no longer need to commit petty crimes to access their heroin. They're actually in a treatment program where they can access safe medication that enables them to reduce their criminal activities as well. And in some locations, it's actually reduced engagement in sex work. So in terms of social inclusion, it's been shown that opioid substitution treatment also has a significant impact on the social inclusion of people who become much more stable, they can retain a job, they can have a very productive life. And I would like to talk to you a bit about cost effectiveness. So there's a tremendous amount of studies that show that opioid substitution treatment is an extremely cost-effective intervention. I just wanted to mention one that's from a study from the UNODC, UNAIDS, and World Health Organization that concludes, and I quote, "According to several conservative estimates, every dollar invested in opioid dependence treatment programs may yield a return of between $4 and $7 in reduced drug-related crime, criminal justice cost, and theft alone. And when savings related to healthcare are included, total savings can exceed costs by a ratio of 12 to 1. So we're talking about significant savings in terms of costs for the government. And here again, there's about 77 countries around the world that have adopted opioid substitution treatment. So with regard to the evidence, and I'm going to go quickly on these slides have been developed by an organization called the Global Commission on Drug Policy. This commission was formed in 2011 by a group of high-level policymakers. So they're former heads of states, presidents, prime ministers, headed by Cardoso, who is the former president of Brazil. And the Global Commission came out with a report called War on Drugs, and they have submitted these specific graphs on the evidence on effectiveness of harm reduction interventions. So on this first graph, you can see the percentage of HIV prevalence among people who inject drugs in countries that have adopted harm reduction interventions from a very early on. And you can see that the prevalence of HIV among these people is rather low. It's below 5% in all these countries. In the second graph, you can see a similar graph, but for countries that have included harm reduction interventions only partially in their countries or a bit later on in the progress of the epidemic. And there you can see that the prevalence of HIV among people who inject drugs is slightly higher. We can say significantly higher, between 10 and 16%. But then you can see, if the graph shows, on the last graph, countries that have continuously resisted large-scale harm reduction interventions. And there you can see a significant proportion of people who inject drugs being infected by HIV that reaches about 43% in Thailand. Something that has been touched upon yesterday by one of the plenary presentations in the morning was the problems of political and legislative barriers to harm reduction. I also wanted to mention the funding issue on harm reduction that's been very well presented by Peter Sorosi just before me. So I'm just going to focus on these barriers here. All around the world, there's a significant issue of policies and practices that go against the access to harm reduction. So for example, that can include the criminalization of possession of a syringe. This obviously is very difficult for a person who uses drugs to go to a needle and syringe exchange program and then get arrested by the police upon exit of the center because they are in possession of a syringe. Another problem can be the criminalization of people who use drugs. So in about 21 jurisdictions around the world, these jurisdictions have actually removed criminal sanctions against people who use drugs. This means that drug use remains illegal, but instead of sending the person to prison, they are actually referred to healthcare services, or they are imposed an administrative sanction. So it's no longer a criminal record, it's no longer a prison sentence. And this has been quite efficient in reducing the barriers to accessing harm reduction and treatment interventions. And to finish, and I'm going to go quickly, I wanted to present you with the case of Portugal, which has actually decriminalized drug use in 2001. So now when a person is stopped by the police in possession of a drug, they are no longer referred to the criminal justice system. They are referred to an administrative body that is composed of a psychologist, a social worker, and a doctor. And they review on a case-by-case basis the person's case, and they refer them to the health and social services that they would need. This intervention has been accompanied by an incredible scale-up of harm reduction interventions. And about 13 years later now, it's easy to see the results. First of all, and something really important, is that there has been no increase in drug use in Portugal. So that's quite important to note. And in terms of health and social outcomes, it's been very positive. And I'm going to go very quickly because I know I'm over time. So there has been a significant increase in overdose deaths and in new HIV cases among people who inject drugs. There has also been no increase in drug-related crimes. And it's actually been quite interesting for law enforcement officers who can now stop focusing their interventions on people who use drugs. They can actually focus on important, violent, high-level crime. So that's actually been quite productive in terms of law enforcement actions. And also, there has been an increase in people accessing drug dependence treatment. So harm reduction really is a way to help people out, both in terms of protecting their health, but also as a bridge towards treatment. And finally, there has been a good improvement in social inclusion, with more people accessing employment and housing, and a reduction in stigmatization of people who use drugs. So I'm going to stop here. I've put a few key references here for you, for those who are interested. And if you'd like to learn more, please don't hesitate to ask me questions here, or just send me an email. Thank you.